I want to welcome you on behalf of the Institute of International Studies and the Center for South Asian Studies. This is the Sanford S. Elberg Lecture Series. It was established in 1987 by the Institute of International Studies in honor of Sanford S. Elberg, Emeritus Professor of Medical Microbiology and Immunology and Emeritus Dean of the Graduate Division. He was Graduate Dean here from 1961 to 1978. This lectureship was endowed with contributions primarily from Dean Elberg's Berkeley colleagues. It honors his tireless efforts and substantial achievements in building the excellence of graduate education at Berkeley, including his support for international studies. Previous lectures have included Ralph Derendorf, Victor Weisskopf, Sadako Ogata, Robert McNamara, Alexander Yakovlev, Larry Brilliant, General Anthony Zinni, Wole Soyinka, Fang Li Zi, Tariq Ali, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Goldstone, James Fallows, and we've had panels on human rights, international law, and the war on terror, and on the Western response to failed states. We're greatly honored today to welcome Shashi Tharoor, who is a distinguished author, politician, and former civil servant. Currently, he is a second-term member of the Indian Parliament representing Trivandrum constituency, and he is chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He has previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. During his nearly 3-decade-long prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and administrator at the highest levels, concluding with the position of Undersecretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. In addition to these two roles, both in Indian politics and at the UN, he is a distinguished and recognized author of both nonfiction books and fiction books, a total of 15 books altogether. And he completed a bachelor's degree at the University of Delhi in New Delhi, and in 1978, at age 22, he was awarded a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. At that time, Tharoor was the youngest person ever to earn a doctorate from the Fletcher School. And I should have mentioned that in 2007 election for Secretary General of the UN, which was won by former South Korean diplomat and politician Ban Ki-moon, the candidate who came in second was Shashi Tharoor. So we're very pleased to welcome him today, and in this way we continue the distinguished roster of international figures honored by the Elberg Lecture. Shashi, welcome.
Thank you very much, Harry, and I must say, listening to that very impressive roster of Elberg lecturers, I was struck by the coincidence that I've actually met all of them, and they are a very, very impressive list indeed. So it's a great pleasure to be following in their footsteps and to see you all here. I don't know the people standing at the back. I'm really anxious to make a quick escape, but if not, there are lots of empty seats, and I hope that you'll make yourselves comfortable, because I've been instructed to speak to you at some length, and I would hate to think of you all with your tired feet listening to me. Well, the topic that we settled on for today was the networked world, how foreign policy is evolving in the 21st century. But as Harry has made clear, I am a member of Parliament from India, and my perspective is necessarily informed by my political preoccupations with my country's place in the world. So I hope the internationalists here will forgive me if I occasionally use India to illustrate some of my larger themes about the evolution of foreign policy across the globe in our times. I've obviously had an extensive international career, but it's not as an unqualified internationalist myself that I address you today. Yes, I've enjoyed the extensive international experience that nearly 3 decades of service at the United Nations gave me. I value the perspective that has given me on the world. But my own focus now for the last 6 years has been as a political figure in India. And in the public life of India, increasingly I found my mind straying to the domestic realities of my country. When I think of the world today, I'm conscious of the need to think of it not just as a former UN official, but from the perspective of a member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram, which, despite being the capital of the state of Kerala, is still 2/3 a rural constituency. And I, therefore, have to tell you that the bulk of my time in recent years has been spent in listening to and giving political expression to the voices of the poor, the marginalized, the downtrodden in my district, all of which in curious ways are linked to the churnings of the wider world at large. In 2012, I wrote a book called Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century. And of course, that title immediately and perhaps naturally was immediately misconstrued by people who thought that Pax Indica must suggest some sort of plan for world domination, as in the familiar Pax Romana or Pax Britannica. What I meant, however, was rather the critical role that India had to play in what I argued has become an increasingly cooperative, networked system in our multipolar world. The idea of Pax Indica to me was therefore not about India as a future world leader or next superpower, the kind of status that assorted commentators have claimed it is heading irresistibly towards in the near future. Instead, Pax Indica, in my conception, was about India's role within the emerging global network, which is really what will define international relations and world politics in the 21st century. And I genuinely believe and hope that the era of any country seeking or claiming to be a world leader is definitively over. To begin with, I must confess I have a problem with the whole idea of world leadership. It's a curiously archaic notion. The very phrase is redolent of Kipling ballads and James Bondian adventures. What makes a country a world leader? If it's population, then we're in with a chance. India's in course to top the charts. We'll overtake China as the world's most populous country by, some accounts say 2034, some say no, it's going faster than that, 2026. If it's military strength, there's some room for debate. India has the world's 4th largest army, but nowhere close to the world leader, the US, which still outspends the rest of the world combined in military strength. Is it nuclear capacity? Well, India has made its status there clear with its explosions of 1998, and that's been formally recognized in the EU Indo-US nuclear deal a decade later. Is it economic development? Well, there India has made extraordinary strides in recent years. It's already the world's 3rd largest economy in PPP, purchasing power parity terms, and it continues to climb, though too many of our people still continue to live destitute amid despair and disrepair. Or could it be a combination of all these, allied to something altogether more difficult to define, soft power? As Joseph Nye has argued in regard to the US, does the power of attraction mean much more today than the force of arms or of economic muscle in wielding influence in the world? Now, much of the conventional analyses of any country's stature in the world tends to rely on these all too familiar economic and hard power assumptions. But as India's example demonstrates, and we in India are famously a land of paradoxes, and amongst those paradoxes that many speak of India as some sort of great power of the 21st century, when we're not yet able to feed, educate, and employ all of our people. So I would say that it's not just economic growth, military strength, even population numbers that you should point to when you think of a nation's potential role in the world of the 21st century. Rather, it's much more the transformation of the terms of global exchange and the way countries adapt to the new international interlinked landscape that will shape their future role and direction. So far from evolving into a world leader, as an Indian, I would say that India will become an active participant in a world that is no longer defined by parameters like superpowers or great powers exercising world leadership. Now, the clear distinctions of 20th century international relations have today evolved into something more complicated to define. We're living in a world marked by the paradox of two seemingly contradictory coexisting forces, those of convergence and of disruption. First are the forces of globalization, irresistibly transforming the world, and the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and our mobile phones and our living rooms snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe in real time. These are the forces of convergence that have made the world one village, one market, one audience. And then there are the other forces, the changes that terrorism has wrought in us, the talk increasingly in the last 20 years of a clash of civilizations, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, and now, of course, the armed conflicts in Iraq and Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, between people of different creeds and cultures and religions. These two groups of phenomena are clearly pulling us together and driving us apart at the same time. So the old binaries of the Cold War era are no longer relevant. New binaries have come up. And at the same time, the distinction between domestic and international is not one of those binaries. It's less and less meaningful in today's world because one is tied to the other much more closely than it might appear. Foreign policy is no longer just foreign. When we think of foreign policy, we have to think of its domestic underpinnings and its domestic implications. The ultimate purpose of any country's foreign policy has to be to promote the security and well-being of its own citizens. We want a world that gives us the conditions of peace and security that will permit us to grow and flourish, safe from foreign depredations, but open to external opportunities. Now, even as a former UN official, I'm perfectly aware that the institutions of global governance today in this interlinked world have been expanding well beyond the United Nations. There are selective intergovernmental mechanisms like the G8 or G7 as they've become again, military alliances like NATO, sub-regional groupings like the Economic Community of West African States, one-issue alliances like the Nuclear Suppliers Group. But those are all states, and you've got other kinds of arrangements. Writers connect under International PEN, soccer players in FIFA, athletes under the International Olympic Committee, mayors in the World Organization of United Cities and Local Governments, bankers listen to the Bank of International Settlements, businessmen to the International Accounting Standards Board. The process of regulating human activity above and beyond national boundaries has never been more widespread. To these elements of international cooperation, we must add a veritable alphabet soup of new bodies and arrangements for multilateral engagement. We're living in a world in which one defining paradigm for foreign policy is impossible. As I said earlier, the binary Cold War era is over. There are no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between. Instead, the metaphor for today's globalized world has to be the metaphor of the World Wide Web itself. In this increasingly networked world, we're going to have to work through multiple connections, countries connected to each other in different arrangements, sometimes overlapping with each other, with common memberships, sometimes distinct. They all serve our interests in different ways and for different purposes. So, as I said, I'll be using a few Indian examples. Let me illustrate what this means with one concrete example. Every year, the Indian foreign minister meets her Russian and Chinese counterparts in a grouping called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans, and she comes up with the BRICS. And they meet together to discuss their common issues. Then she'll subtract the Russians and the Chinese, and the other three will get together in a grouping called IPSA, for South-South cooperation. And then she'll add the Chinese, but not the Russians, in a grouping called BASIC for environmental negotiations. And of course, it helps that India is the only one that's a member of all of these, and not merely because its name begins very usefully with that indispensable element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because these groupings are all useful to each member for different ways and different subjects for different purposes. And in each of them, each member has a valuable contribution to make. Now, this kind of World Wide Web-style networking reflects other paradoxes of our world. India can play an influential role, for example, both within the United Nations, a universal organization with 193 member states, but also in its own neighborhood with SARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, that only has its 7 neighbors. It belongs to both the non-aligned movement, which reflects India's experience of colonialism, and to the community of democracies, which reflects its 65 years of experience as a democracy, alongside the very countries it's bitterly denouncing in the non-aligned movement. Or take the fact that India is a leading light of the Global Trade Union of Developing Countries, the G77, the group of 77, which actually has 120 countries, but that's not the matter. But it also is a member of the global management of the world economy in the shape of the G20, where global macroeconomic policy is being made by the world's biggest economies. Now, I speak as an Indian that this is an example of how a country like India has the great ability to be in all these institutional networks, pursuing different objectives with different allies and partners, and in each finding a valid purpose that suits itself and the other members. So when I was minister, I suggested that India had essentially moved beyond non-alignment to something I call multi-alignment. I must admit the phrase hasn't caught on, but that's what I meant, these multiple links around the world. And what I've said about India is true of most countries. You can take your own country, if you come from a different country, and trace similar links to the ones I've described, and you'll see what I mean by the networked world. But why limit ourselves to thinking about organizational structures and its member states alone? The world has changed in other ways too. The inescapable reality of our times is that of globalization, which affects everything and, of course, lurks behind our most commonplace headlines. I don't know, the evening is too young for me to risk this terrible joke, but it was a good one time. You all remember the headlines a few years ago commemorating the 10th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. Now, why am I mentioning this? What's this got to do with globalization? Well, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They're then chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles or scooters into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the story is now being told to you in Berkeley, California, by an Indian member of parliament from Thiruvananthapuram. That's globalization. So, the world has all of these extraordinary connections, and I'll give you a different kind of illustration of how much the world has changed and is changing. A generation ago, the US led the world in every category, right? You made the biggest planes, built the tallest buildings, had the largest malls, created and sold the most innovative products, produced the most millionaires. Today, the smartest executive jets in the world are made by Embraer of Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, which has just overtaken the previous tallest building, which was in Taipei, and which in turn overtook one in Malaysia. The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The world's largest Ferris wheel is in Singapore. The biggest shopping mall is in Beijing. And just 4 years ago, the country with the largest number of nationals that year in the Forbes list of the world's 10 richest people was actually India, with 4 billionaires whose combined assets, then valued at $180 billion, exceeded those of the majority of the member states of the United Nations. 30 years ago, all of these categories would have been headed by the United States. The US remains the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up fast in various areas where it alone had been dominant. It's not so much the decline of the West as the rise of the rest. And this is something which, again, is a hallmark of the world we live in today. So today, whether you're a resident of Delhi or Dili, I mean, the capital of India or the capital of Timor-Leste, Thailand or Taiwan, or whether you're from Chennai or China, it is simply not realistic anymore to think only in terms of your own country. Global forces press in from every conceivable direction. People, goods, and ideas cross borders and cover vast distances with ever greater frequency, speed, and ease. We are increasingly connected through trade, travel, the internet. You can move investments of billions of dollars with a click of the mouse. You can be in touch. When I was your age, we used to have pen pals. You would write a letter to some stranger in a foreign country and stick a stamp on it and wait a month and a half for a reply to come. Today, you can deal with strangers half a globe away with a few strokes of a keyboard to an email address. I mean, the transformations that have happened now, what we watch, what we eat, even the games we play have all crossed all conceivable limitations and boundaries. You can even see cricket in the United States. My God, killed to be able to do that when I was a graduate student here. Jobs everywhere, too, depend not only on local firms and factories, but on faraway markets for the products and services they produce, on licenses and access from foreign governments, on an international environment that allows the free movement of goods and of persons, on international institutions that ensure stability and structure. In short, on the international system that sustains our networked and increasingly globalizing world. Now, I'm sometimes reminded when I talk about this of a dreadful old joke we used to tell around the Security Council, which probably could also be told about political science professors at Berkeley, but I'll stick to the Security Council, where an American diplomat and a French diplomat are arguing about a practical problem, and the American says, you know what we can do this and this and this, and we can solve it. And the French diplomat, who really was a Berkeley political science professor in disguise, but anyway, the French diplomat says, yes, 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 that will work in practice, but will it work in theory? And the truth is what I've described to you doesn't have a theory attached to it yet. I'm not sure that all the earnest scholars of international affairs here have yet found a theory to fit them, but this is the world that's working in practice. This is the world that has evolved, that we live in, that I've seen in practice in my years at the UN, in my years as an Indian parliamentarian, as somebody who's been looking and writing and speaking about international affairs. And I suspect that your own stories in practice aren't very different. I mean, what does it mean to be a young person in Delhi today, for instance? It can mean waking up to an alarm clock made in China, downing a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, donning jeans designed in America, and taking a Japanese scooter or a Korean car to get to an Indian college, where your textbooks might be printed with German-invented technology on paper first pulped in Sweden. You might call your friends on a Finnish or Taiwanese mobile phone to invite them to an Italian pizza, or even what you think of as an Indian meal, featuring naan that came to us from Persia, tandoori chicken taught to us by rulers from Uzbekistan, and potatoes and green chilies that first came to India only 400 years ago from Latin America. And of course, the most Indian thing of all is suspicion of anything foreign. Now, this is the inescapable world of the 21st century, and these benign forces are matched by more malign ones that are equally global. The world of convergence that I've described, as I said earlier, is also full of disruption. In my time at the UN, I learned that the world is full of problems without passports, as we call them in Kofi Annan's day. Problems that cross all frontiers uninvited. Problems of terrorism, of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, of the degradation of our common environment, of contagious disease and chronic starvation, of human rights and human wrongs, of mass illiteracy and massive displacement. Such problems also require solutions that cross all frontiers, since no one country or one group of countries can solve them alone. Now, we in India were reminded of this yet again on 26 November 2008, 2611 as we call it, when terrorists from Pakistan assaulted Mumbai and murdered over 180 people in cold blood. The terrorists of 26/11 used the instruments and symbols of globalization and convergence, the ease of communications, GPS systems, mobile telephone technology, because they were getting instructions. The handlers were calling from Pakistan on their mobile phones, even as they were killing their victims, telling them what to do. Five-star hotels frequented by the transnational business elite and so on, as instruments for their fanatical agenda. A few years earlier, on 9/11 in New York, rather than as forces to bring the world closer together, the terrorists also used similar tools. The jet aircraft being crashed into those towers emblematic of global capitalism, while the doomed victims on those planes made frantic mobile telephone calls to their loved ones. In other words, the very forces that through globalization are pulling us together, as I've said at the beginning, seem at the very same time to be driving us apart. The terrible notion of this clash of civilizations that has entered our discourse. I'm not a big fan of that theory, and we can talk about that if you're interested during the Q&A, but it is unarguable that the previously benign forces of religion, culture, society have become causes of conflict in many places rather than merely of personal succor. Both 9/11 and 26/11 were grotesque reflections of this paradoxical phenomenon. At the same time, 9/11 had already reminded us of the cliché of the global village, right? A fire that starts in a dusty cave or a thatched hut somewhere in some remote corner of the global village, which nonetheless blazes strong enough to melt the steel girders holding up the tallest skyscrapers at the other end of the global village. In such a world, issues that may have once seemed very far away are very much in your backyard. What happens in East Asia or South Africa, from protectionist politics to deforestation and desertification to the fight against AIDS, can affect your lives where you live in North America. And your choices anywhere. What you buy, how you vote, can resound far away. As someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We're all interconnected, and we can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet in anything we do. So to my young listeners at this university, let me say that in our 21st century world, you're likely to spend a lot of your adult lives interacting with people who don't look, sound, dress, or eat like you. That you might work for an internationally oriented company with clients, colleagues, or investors from around the globe. That you're likely to take your holidays in more and more far-flung destinations. Of course, all of this may already be true for many of you here. The world into which you will grow will be full of such opportunities, but along with such opportunities, you will also find yourself vulnerable to threats from beyond our borders. Terrorism, of course, but also transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, and even imported illnesses like swine flu. Now, wouldn't you want your government to devise policies to deal with such challenges that would affect your and one day your children's lives? Should such policies in an ever more interdependent, networked world even be called foreign policies? One of the reasons that foreign policy matters today is that foreign policy is no longer merely foreign. It affects you right here where you live. All of us want our governments to seize the opportunities that the 21st century world provides while managing the risks and protecting you from the threats that this world has also opened you up to. Everyone, therefore, has a growing stake in international developments. To put it another way, the food we eat, food we grow for that matter, the air we breathe, our health, our security, prosperity, quality of life, are increasingly affected by what happens beyond our borders. And that means we can simply no longer afford to be indifferent about the rest of the world, however distant some international problems may appear. India has been directly affected, of course, by both these global trends of convergence and disruption. On the one hand, we're a far more globalized economy than most, and more so than we ever were in the days when we raised the protectionist barriers to shield us while we developed our autonomous national capabilities. I come from a country that's now much more connected through trade and travel than ever before with the international system. trade and foreign investment accounts for a steadily increasing share of our GDP. Our relationship with each of the major powers has grown rapidly. China, a country with which we fought a war 5 decades ago, is now our largest single trading partner. Today we can admit that our links with the world are the reason for the highest ever growth rates we enjoyed between 2003 and 2008. I believe something like this is true of most countries, certainly of many and possibly of most countries in the globalized world of today. But of course the global situation has been changing considerably. Politically, we are entering a period of transition from dominance by a single power, and you know which one that is, to a more balanced distribution of power in the international system, though this still falls short of true multipolarity. New powers are rising, new alliances are forming, and we're witnessing, of course, the rise of a new global power in China. Challenges in our immediate neighborhood, from an Indian point of view, have made us in India conscious that our development is vulnerable to the impact of forces and events across our borders. But that's also true of most countries. As the world transitions to something like real multipolarity, we should realize that the existing power holders can hardly be expected to easily cede power to others. Even if in academic seminars you might have the notion of new rising powers taken for granted, the fact is no formally risen power is prepared to fall today. Many will seek to stay in place, even if it means continuing the existing inequities in the international order. In turn, this will mean an opportunity for other countries to build new coalitions with each other in their efforts to find a better place in the sun. This could lead to clashes. I didn't imply, I hope, that all coalitions and all networks were necessarily benign and constructive. But the clashes could be avoided if the entire international architecture is reshaped cooperatively, an objective that I certainly feel my country should work towards. And that brings me back to global governance, a phrase I've used once or twice already. It's kind of a phrase that's rather like Englishmen discussing the weather. You know, everyone talks about it, but no one actually does anything to change it. The principal institutions of global governance today are those that emerged after the disasters of the first half of the 20th century. In the first half of the 20th century, the world saw 2 world wars, countless civil wars, mass expulsions of populations, and the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima. Then things changed. In 1945 and after that, a group of far-sighted leaders were determined to make the second half of the 20th century different from the first. So they drew up rules to govern international behavior, and they founded institutions in which different nations could cooperate for the common good. That was the idea of global governance, right? To foster international cooperation, to elaborate consensual global norms, and to establish predictable, universally applicable rules to the benefit of all. This has worked, but it seems increasingly out of date. As we look around the world of 2015, we can't fail to note the increase in the number of major powers across the world since the structures of the international system were put in place in 1945, 70 years ago. It's an undeniable fact that the emerging powers have moved very much from the periphery to the center of global discourse and global responsibility, and they now have a legitimate and an increasingly voluble desire to share power and responsibility in the global system. So too do these new social forces, NGOs, civil society movements, which have become impossible to ignore in any discussion of global governance. The dominance of a handful of small industrialized Western countries, especially in the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions or organizations, looks increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has shifted irresistibly from the West to the East. With all of this and the emergence of new powers and forces which, unlike China, were omitted from the high table in 1945, we have clearly reached a point where there is a need for a system redesign of global governance to ensure that all countries can participate in a manner commensurate with their capacity. As the line goes, you're either at the table or on the menu. more and more countries have had enough of being on the menu and want to claim a seat at the table. Clearly, what we're looking for is a more inclusive multilateralism, and not, as some Americans once suggested, a sort of G2 condominium between America and China. There's a consensus in our country, in India, that India should seek to contribute to international security and prosperity, to a well-ordered and equitable world, and to democratic sustainable development for all. This means that in the wake of the global economic crisis that's affected all of us in the last few years, that we must work to redistribute power in the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, as well as in the political organs of global governance, such as the UN Security Council. It's simply not reasonable to run the world's premier international organization on the basis of the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than of 2015. To start with the UN itself, the issue of UN restructuring must be pursued in an environment in which change is the only constant. If I may be permitted the indulgence of a brief personal reminiscence, it would relate to how much my old organization, the UN, has been transformed in the career span that Harry briefly summarized of this one former UN official standing before you. If I'd even suggested to my seniors when I joined the organization back in 1978 that the UN would one day observe and even run elections in sovereign states, that the UN would conduct intrusive inspections for weapons of mass destruction, impose comprehensive sanctions on the entire import-export trade of a member state, and that to a medium-sized member state, not a small one, create a counter-terrorism committee to monitor the actions of national governments against terrorists, or set up international criminal tribunals and coerce governments into handing over their own citizens, sometimes their own former presidents, for trial by foreigners under international law. If I had said any of these things in 1978, I'm sure my seniors would have told me that I simply did not understand what the United Nations was all about. And indeed, since it was the late 1970s, they would have probably asked, "Young man, what have you been smoking?" And yet the UN has done every one of these things during the last 2 decades and more. It's a reflection of how much the world around us has evolved since the era when the Cold War seemed frozen in place, borders seemed immutable, and the Soviet Union looked like it would last forever. If all of those things could change so dramatically within one generation, shouldn't we expect and indeed work for similar changes to happen in the course of the next generation? And if so, how do we want the world that will emerge to be organized? This leads me almost inevitably to UN reform. It's kind of a malady where all the doctors gather around the patient. They all agree on the diagnosis, but they can't agree on the prescription. And that's the problem we have. The diagnosis is clear. Just to cite three quick examples. When the UN was founded, the Security Council had just 11 members, but out of a total UN membership of only 51 countries, right? So 22% of the UN's membership was in the Security Council. Today it's 15 out of a total membership of 193, so it's fewer than 8% of the membership in the Security Council. So a larger number of states, as well as a larger percentage, feel unrepresented or underrepresented and unheard in the world's premier institution for the maintenance of global peace and security. Second example, the oddity that Europe, with 5% of the world's population, has 33% of the seats in the Security Council. That's, to put it mildly, somewhat questionable. Third example, the fact that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council enjoy their permanent positions and their right to veto because they happened to have won a war 70 years ago. It's difficult to justify any institutional arrangement in the 21st century by an event of history that took place 7 decades ago. There's therefore a clear need for an expansion of the Security Council in both categories, permanent and non-permanent. But beyond the Security Council, many would like to see the General Assembly strengthened as the primary intergovernmental legislative body, which it's not yet. It has become too often a rhetorical forum, prone to declaratory effulgences which essentially end up without effect, rather than one which acts as a legislative body driving the actual action of the UN organization. The UN's Economic and Social Council, too, should become a more meaningful development-oriented body and a serious instrument of development governance, which it's not yet. And a greater sharpening is also required in the focus and operational efficiency of the UN funds, agencies, and programs, whose effectiveness is so important for so many of the world's vulnerable and developing people. The international financial institutions set up at Bretton Woods in 1944 are also in need of reform, since they too reflect the realities of a vanished era. Belgium, until 2008 to 2009, disposed of exactly the same weighted vote as China in these institutions. Belgium, okay? And China, the world's second largest economy. Now, the G20 summit in Pittsburgh in September 2009 set in motion a process for a global redesign of the international financial and economic architecture, though after an initial shift, it hasn't yet achieved its own objective of full parity between the developed economies on the one hand and the emerging or developing and transition economies on the other. Still, with Pittsburgh, the G20 started emerging as the premier forum for international economic cooperation. The G20 has become a meaningful platform for North-South cooperation and dialogue precisely because the South is not completely outweighed and outvoted by the North in the composition of the G20. I think that countries like India must use their positions on the G20 in the grouping to pursue a long-term objective of broad parity between the developed countries and the developing and transition economies in these institutions. After all, the recent global financial crisis showed that the surveillance of risk by international institutions and early warning mechanisms are needed for all countries. Where was the economic crisis? It was here in the developed West, in the so-called rich countries. It's important that in the context of global governance, the developing countries should have a voice too in overseeing the global financial performance of all nations, rather than it simply continuing to be a case of the rich countries supervising the economic delinquency of the poor, because that simply is not a reflection of reality anymore. The world economic crisis, after all, started as a financial crisis at the heart of the Western system, and it's not yet ended. Ask the Greeks if you think it has, you know. Now, fortunately, yes, well, a country like India has been affected. Everyone has. It's been one of the few economies that continue to show growth and is expected to attain more than 7% in our current fiscal year. But it's not clear that the world is going to enter an expansionary phase in the global economy anytime soon. Our search for markets, technology, resources to fuel our growth will be more complicated than it has been in the recent past. So coming back to the Indian example, while India's strategic goals must remain the same in this networked world I've described to you, to enable the domestic transformation of India by accelerating our growth, preserving our strategic autonomy, protecting our people, and responsibly helping to shape the world, achieving these goals in the present economic climate in a networked world will be a challenge to our skill and ingenuity. As protectionism grows and closes markets, as credit is sucked back into developed country economies for their own stimulus and recovery, every country will have to rely more on growing its own domestic market. And so the importance of every country, particularly developing countries, using this international system to pull their own poor people out of poverty and into the 21st century global economic system becomes all the more essential. But if you take countries like India trying to do this, and as I say, like India, because there are many countries who are trying the same thing themselves, the energy demands this process will make on the world will be huge. And certainly in India, we're conscious we must pursue this responsibly through a mix of efficient and environmentally friendly means. So hydroelectricity, wind electricity, solar electricity, nuclear, all of this is being pursued in India, in addition to the still unavoidable thermal and petroleum or gas-driven forms of energy. And then our foreign policy must serve this objective too, which is why the Indo-US nuclear deal was so important a step in this direction. We have to amend our climate change policies to respect global concerns about global warming while preserving the capacity to do something. After all, there are 600 million people in India who cannot take for granted what any American can, that you can flick a switch on a wall and be bathed in light. That isn't available to nearly half our population. We need to be able to make that possible. We've got to connect the deprived and excluded amongst our people to the opportunities the 21st century offers. Our demand for food will inevitably rise as well. India's and other growing developing countries. India's estimate the demand for food may rise by 50% in the next 2 decades as a result of our growing population, their rising affluence, and the improved dietary possibilities available to a larger middle class. We need to multiply our sources of food, including acquiring agricultural land abroad if necessary. So in Africa and Latin America, there are Indians buying up land to grow crops to ship over to India. The Chinese are doing similar things. These are all changes in the world that were not even contemplated a generation ago. Lack of access to stable supplies of water is reaching critical proportions, particularly for agricultural purposes. And the problem will worsen because of rapid urbanization everywhere in the developing world over the next 20 years. So you'll need skillful and creative diplomacy to ensure that interruptions in the flow of water across borders do not bedevil relations with your neighbors. And at the same time, I want to keep underscoring the initial point that foreign policy is basically about fulfilling domestic objectives. But as an Indian, let me say, we can't afford to forget that if we succeed, or when we succeed, in our national transformation, we will be including more and more of our people in the great narrative of hope that has been the narrative of social and economic development in the West over the last 200 years. We'll be connecting 500 million Indians, perhaps, to their own country and to the rest of the world. 500 million Indian villagers will join the global village. I mean, that's an exciting prospect in some ways, and I'm sure for some an alarming one. But that's what we are looking towards in the next generation. What does all this mean for our world that is in the process of being reshaped? What can we project for the world of the next 20 years? It follows from what I've said that the international system, as constructed following the Second World War, will be almost unrecognizable by, let's say, 2030, owing to the rise of the emerging powers, the transformed global economy, a real transfer of relative wealth and economic power from the West or the North to other countries in the global South, the growing influence of non-state actors, including terrorists, multinational corporations, criminal networks, in this networked world. In the next 2 decades, this new international system will be coping with the issues of aging populations in the developed world, increasing energy, food, and water constraints, worries about climate change and migration. The transformation of a country like India will mean that resource issues, including energy, food, and water, on all of which demand will outstrip projected available supplies, as soon as the next decade or so, will gain prominence on the international agenda. The need for increased, more democratic and more equitable global governance, therefore, cannot be denied. And if you look further, growth projections for the BRICS countries indicate they will collectively match the original G7 share of global GDP sometime between 2040 and 2050. So whereas the G7 was meant to be the biggest economies in the world, could make decisions for the global economy, the BRICS countries, none of which is a member of the G7, will collectively outstrip the G7 in 30 to 40 years. That's the kind of world we're looking at. And they'll all, of course, continue to enjoy relatively rapid economic growth and will therefore want to strive for a multipolar world in which they're amongst the poles in this world. Now, the experts tell us that historically emerging multipolar systems have been more unstable than bipolar or unipolar ones. And the ongoing global financial crisis underlines that the next 20 years, the transitions that I've talked about, are fraught with risks for the global system. Global policymakers will have to cope with a growing demand for multilateral cooperation when the international system will be stressed by the incomplete transition from the old to the new order. And perhaps some of the new players will not want to cooperate under the old rules. The multiplicity of actors on the international scene could have properly accommodated, add strength to our aging post-World War II institutions, or they could fragment the international system and reduce international cooperation. Countries like India have no desire to challenge the international system, as did other rising powers like Germany and Japan in the 19th and early 20th centuries. All they want is to be given a place at the global high table. Without that, they'd be likely to volunteer to share the primary burden for without being given a place at the table, they'd be unlikely to volunteer to share the burden, the primary burden for dealing with such issues as terrorism, climate change, proliferation, energy security, which will concern everybody on this planet. Now, these issues are going to remain key concerns even as resource issues move up on the international agenda. Terrorism, as I've said earlier, is a tragic blight of our times, but its appeal could diminish if economic opportunities for youth are increased and greater political pluralism is offered in many societies. If this century has, in the famous phrase from the First World War, made the world safe for democracy, then the next challenge is also to create a world safe for diversity. It's in India's interest to ensure that the world as a whole must reflect the idea that's already familiar to most Indians, that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the language you speak, the kind of food you eat, the God you choose to worship or not, so long as you want to play by the same rules as everybody else and dream the same dreams. It's not essential in a democratic world to agree all the time, so long as we agree on the ground rules of how we will disagree. These are the global principles we must strive to uphold if we are able to continue to uphold them securely in each of our home countries. Today, I think most countries can take their sovereignty for granted. We know no one would dare to threaten our sovereignties anymore. Our strategic autonomy is a fact of life and not something we need to fight for. We are now in a position to graduate from a focus on our own sovereign autonomy to exercising a vision of responsibility on this networked global stage I've described to you. In the case of India, from a post-colonial concern with self-protection to a new role participating in the making of global rules and even playing a role in creating some of those rules. Well, I think I've taken the 50 minutes you wanted me to. We were all like Egyptian mummies anyway, strapped for time. Let me pull my strands together. My basic point is that we have to think beyond world leadership and global domination to cooperative relationships in a networked world. Sovereign nation states will continue proudly to guard their sovereignty, but the world will inevitably pull them together in ways that transforms the very definition of the word and dilutes its old meanings. Most of us belong to countries that proudly and somewhat chauvinistically celebrate their Independence Day. The time may come when we realize that what we really ought to celebrate the rest of the time is something else. The recognition that every other day on the calendar in our globalized and networked world is really an Interdependence Day. Thank you very much.